This is great. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for sticking around for the second part of me talking today. And I don't have a very formal plan here because I know some of you have read the book, and so I wanted to make sure there was like a good amount of time if people had questions. So all I'm planning to do is tell you a little bit about me, how this book came together, and then I'm going to read a piece of it, and then maybe we can just have some back and forth. Does that work? Great. Well, first of all, thank you, so many of you, for reading it. I really appreciate that. I keep finding myself saying, I wish it was not so timely. Unfortunately, it remains increasingly timely, and so weird to stay relevant in that way, but I'm grateful to be in conversation with you all and for the work that this church is doing to take these ideas and these commitments and conversations and translate them into action. So thank you all. My name's Erin. I grew up in rural upstate New York in a little town called Mechanicville, about 3 hours north of New York City. And I grew up kind of 1 foot in the church and 1 foot in organized labor. So my dad was a locally ordained United Methodist pastor in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains. And my mom and my grandma were both union labor organizers. My grandma was an immigrant and actually was interrogated by the feds on suspicion of communist activity during the McCarthy era, just mostly for being a young working class immigrant. But that was at the very beginning of her organizing career. She was almost deported for that work, and she went on to continue organizing, winning better wages and conditions at multiple factories that she worked at. She got cancer twice, both times it seems from workplace-related environmental pollution. Beat it twice. So I feel very lucky and proud to stand in the lineage of pretty scrappy people in going back a few generations in my family. And growing up in the church for me was kind of an exposure to many parts of the world and many dynamics of power in the world that I think I would not have seen had I not grown up in the church, and that was both in terms of best case scenarios and also in terms of some worst case scenarios. But I, particularly when my dad became a pastor when I was 9, and was sent, because Methodists send you, to a very small, very rural, isolated, very poor community in South Corinth, New York. So again, the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains. And that's probably the first place that I witnessed, I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, clearly witnessed like what was the spread of white Christian nationalist networks? How was it reaching people through media, through radio? Again, this was a United Methodist church, so even though there were conservative elements, particularly around gender and sexuality in the church, it was really not like a far-right reactionary network, but a community that geographically had been reached by very strident white Christian nationalist ideology, again, mostly I think through media, through radio. And I just remember being a kid, I hadn't come out yet. So I'm trans, and I had a multi-phased coming out process. The first coming out I was 15 years old. But even before that, I just had a very strange feeling about like what was happening in this tiny church where folks were really struggling. They were keeping each other alive through the way they distributed food, through the way they helped each other stay warm in the winter. Like there's plenty of folks in the congregation who could not afford to keep their homes heated in the winter in the Adirondacks. So people had real problems, like really struggled. And yet, like none of that was what the life of the community theologically or politically revolved around. Like the central point of conflict was around human sexuality, specifically the inclusion of LGBTQ people. I just remember being a kid and being like, why are these people obsessed with gay people? Like they cannot heat their homes in the wintertime. What do gay people have to do with that? And I grew up, like left the church for a long time, eventually came back, went to seminary, still really wondering what was going on here. And it wasn't until I had an experience of being able to study in Central America and study theology in Central America that I was with rural communities that were just as geographically isolated, if not more so, than the one I came up in. Just as poor, if not more so, than the one I came up in. Just as, like, for their own survival, like, committed to taking care of each other as the community I came up in. But their theology, Christian, again, these are Christian, like, based communities in rural El Salvador. Their theology was completely different. And that shifted the way people talked about everything. So I met communities that were actively like supporting the survival initiatives of LGBTQ people, specifically trans people who were involved in sex work, impacted by HIV and AIDS, all this kind of stuff. And I was like, what's going on here? What's happening? So I decided to go to seminary after that. And the whole time, I was involved in organizing efforts. I went to school in New York City. I was with very multiracial, spanning geography, organizing across many lines of difference religiously, culturally, all kinds of things. But I kept hearing from really long-term organizers, including like veteran Black Panthers, like people who had been committed to the work of racial and economic justice in this country and beyond for a very long time. People need to go back and organize the communities they're from. Like we're not gonna get anywhere if people continue to write off huge swaths of the country. Like, because all you're doing then is really leaving people isolated, and whatever demagogue wants to step into that vacuum and tell people why they're suffering, like with falsehoods or half-truths or manipulation, is gonna step into that. And so that's how I ultimately ended up doing the rural organizing and church planting work that shaped a lot of the content of this book. Is I, through the Episcopal Church, started a congregation in Grays Harbor County. They're still around, called Chaplains on the Harbor, and it's really hospitality, community building, and leadership development of directly impacted people. And I think I'm going to read a piece of the book that speaks specifically to what role faith communities and what's the role of religion in a time like this, right? In a moment like this where we're seeing just every day a new pretty mind-blowing level of escalation, right, in terms of white Christian nationalist influence, activity, excess use of repressive measures, excess use of violence in policy, but also in, just in terms of social violence. What role do communities that follow Jesus, that are committed to inclusion, that are committed to the work of justice and hospitality truly for all people, what is our role in a time like this? And if the book sounds a little funny, or like maybe it hasn't caught up to the moment we're in, I did have to write it before Election Day, so that was a big unknown. I had a sinking feeling that things would go the way they went, but just for context, I had to do some guessing. So this is from rule number 6. Every chapter is a rule for countering white Christian nationalism. And rule number 6 is get a religious strategy, even if you aren't religious. Can we imagine what it looks like for religion and spirituality to play a role in countering the movement of white Christian nationalism? Not as a pious one-person protest shouting down the MAGA camp, but something powerful enough and collective enough to make a difference. We have plenty of examples from history, but what would it look like today? Could you imagine a spiritually anchored mass liberation movement so strong and effective that it captures a major party or births a new, truly viable third party of poor and struggling people and forces policy positions that actually adequately address the crises of poverty, climate change, systemic racism, gender-based violence, ableism, homelessness, incarceration, and more? Having a religious strategy doesn't mean that you personally need to become religious. What it means is that you understand the pivotal role that religion has played in social movements throughout U.S. history. It means you don't write off all religious communities as inherently irrelevant, though some may be, or inherently oppressive, though some certainly are. What it means is that you study the way white Christian nationalists distort religion to further their political project, and that you understand the value of exposing that distortion. So I think the first thing we have to do, if we're going to do this, is be with folks at the bottom. Second, we have to speak and move with people in a way that resonates more deeply than white Christian nationalism. If white Christian nationalism is seeking to exploit people's fear and anger through misdirection and through religious scapegoating, which it is doing that, spoiler alert, then we have to be able to help people aim their real fear and their real anger at the systems and policies, the powers and principalities, that are actually responsible for regular people's suffering. And we have to disrupt the religious scapegoating. We cannot do this simply by indiscriminately shitting on people of faith. Sorry, that's how I wrote it in the book, and I couldn't think of a quick substitution. And I say all that because most progressive organizing in this country won't go near religion or spirituality with a 10-foot pole. So by religion here, I mean the formal organized belief systems, institutions, etc. And by spirituality, I mean sacred experiences, encounters, and rituals that exist both within and outside of religion. And I get that. I get that a lot of people who have found their way toward progressivism have often pointed themselves in that direction in the first place because they've been deeply hurt and traumatized by religion in the form of white Christian nationalism. And I get, in a very personal way, that religious trauma can put a hurting on your ability to trust the power and intelligence of collective spiritual practice, when most of what you've personally experienced is spiritual malpractice. But let's be clear about something. White Christian nationalism does not have a corner on the market of spirituality, religion, morality, Christianity, or even God's own self. And the very fact that white Christian nationalists want you to believe that they are the only real Christians should tell you just how powerful of a role religion plays in the service of social movements. This is not about having a gotcha approach to Christian nationalism, just so that we can feel like smug, right? Or smarter than them, or self-satisfied in understanding the power of religion than white Christian nationalists do. White Christian nationalists don't care about your smugness or self-satisfaction. They care about power, and they have it. If we don't have it, we clearly don't understand the power of religion better than they do. And so that's not to say, right, that white Christian nationalists are doing a better job of following Jesus because they're in power. What I'm saying is that they understand the role that faith and spirituality play in the lives of millions of regular hurting people. And they have figured out how to exploit that to the benefit of their political movement. So if we want to effectively counter white Christian nationalism, we need to understand the role that faith and spirituality can play in the lives of millions of regular hurting people, and how we leverage that for the sake of justice. It's like, in this moment in particular, right, can sound like a tall ask, like we are hemmed in on every side, but it is not crazy talk, it is US history. Ministers and evangelists ran the Underground Railroad. The civil rights movement was incubated in church basements. And for every genocidal zealot in American history who has claimed religion for a cover for what they're doing, there are just as many faithful people who, because of their moral code and spiritual training, have stood against injustice. Spirituality is important for social movements because it lasts longer than a campaign cycle. Because it can anchor mass numbers of people in the day-to-day work of survival, even when no one's paying them to do it, and because it can build resilience in the face of crisis and loss. Human beings are not disembodied heads interested in endless, obsessive analysis over the latest polling data. We look at the world around us with human eyes. We look for human relationships. We look for community. Those are a lot of the things that white Christian nationalist networks on the ground actually lead with. That's how people are pulled in who would otherwise not be attracted to a lot of the ideology that is being spun. So what would it take to pull enough people into a counter movement that's strong enough to really build power? And what would it take to get them to stick and stay through generations of rebuilding this society from the bottom up? And I think we actually have the beginning of this movement already, scattered across thousands of hard-up neighborhoods across the country. A very grassroots but deeply relational network tethered together by small but powerful groups doing the work of holding their communities together regardless of all the storms that come. So these are a lot of the outfits that we worked with in the Poor People's Campaign. It's like Chaplains on the Harbor in Grays Harbor County. It's groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who are agricultural workers in Florida, or the National Union of the Homeless, which is homeless folks self-organizing across the country. Countless other local networks coming together to organize the bottom not only through campaigns, but also through arts, culture, projects of survival, healing, deep community building, and spiritual care. Something that you have to understand about poor people's organizing is that it is spiritual. It is spiritual. Death stalks constantly. I would say that we as poor people are very in touch with our mortality, and we as poor people are forced to see the really stark truth behind so many hypocrisies that prop up this society. We as poor people survive on the joyful grit and militant tenderness that keeps us finding beauty, laughter, and lifelines amid the wreckage of daily apocalypse. And so I would say that being spiritual, it doesn't mean that we as poor people automatically trust religious institutions or even God, but I will say that the really detached, dry, jargony, academic language and culture that a lot of progressives use also really falls short. Spirituality is, you all know, it's not an idea. It's not a theory. It's not even like a warm, comforting feeling. It's something more powerful. I think faith is when we decide we deserve life, when the powers and principalities of this world tell us that we do not. Religion is a moral code. It is a moral habit that sits deeper in you than all your other habits. And so by that definition, a lot of poor folks put nice, respectable, church-going Christians to shame. How? I cannot tell you the number of times I've watched other poor people spend their literal last dime to help somebody who needed it more. I rarely see, and I say as a church-going Christian, I rarely see church-going Christians do the same. I think the role of churches like this one and like other churches that are committed, again, to the thriving and dignity of all people through the gospel command to love your neighbor as yourself, are so important, because there are churches out there that literally preach that poor people, that LGBTQ people, many other historically oppressed communities deserve to die. Because, and then you list the number of things, right? Because we're felons, we're junkies, we're homeless, we're not saved, etc. We can't just counter that idea by saying, well, the people who say it are dumb, believing in God is dumb, religious people are wishful thinkers. Like, we can't just have a response that skips over religion. Whether we're religious personally or not, all faith traditions, including Christianity, stand in judgment of people who abuse their power, especially those who abuse it in order to keep people dying from healthcare denial, freezing to death on the street, or being killed with impunity, either at the hands of law enforcement or military operations. And so I think we have this really core role of preaching and practicing and teaching that all people deserve to live. So that's a little excerpt. And I wonder if folks have questions or things that just feel live for you. I see a microphone.
Do. Ah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could define what Christians mean by white Christian nationalism.
I can. Let me flip to the page in the book where I wrote it down, because I can never actually remember all of them. Okay. I have 5 core components of how I understand white Christian nationalism. This is not the Bible, but these are some of the most live things that I think about when I think of it. So, white Christian nationalism at its core, it's an ideology that says these 5 things. Number 1, America is a Christian nation. It was founded on Christian ideals, and chosen by God as a light to the world, the very land itself not stolen, but given to white Europeans by God. So if anything bad happened here, slavery, genocide, poverty, mass political repression, may be regrettable, but it must have been necessary for the sake of advancing God's intended destiny for this nation. So component number one, America is a Christian nation. Component number two, in the eyes of God, only people who fall on the right side of power and wealth in this country deserve life, dignity, full inclusion, and the right to be here. So if you know anything about U.S. history, you know that really tips the scales heavily against many of us. Black people, brown people, indigenous people, immigrants, non-Christians, disabled people, women, queer and trans people, but not to mention a bajillion broke white people as well. And in this moment, really anybody who's not a billionaire. So that's component number two. Only people who are doing well. Like if you're successful, that's because God wants you to be, and if you're suffering, it's your own fault. You must have messed up. Component number three, strict traditional rules around family, gender, and sexuality have to be enforced. Traditional in quotes, because there's a lot of inventing and reinventing history here. So that means, on the one hand, ensuring that the right kind of people keep making babies and growing the population in ways that are advantageous to those who are already in power. And on the other hand, it means really systematically robbing the majority of us of bodily autonomy, safety, thriving, the freedom to form consensual relationships, freedom to form our families on our own terms. The fourth component, there should be no separation of church and state. Or if there is, that separation only serves to protect and defend Christians and Christian institutions from any and all state intervention. And again, this goes back to the point of, in a white Christian nationalist interpretation of history, all of the founding fathers were Christians, and their main goal was to protect Christians from big government, not the other way around. And then the last component of white Christian nationalism I think is important to lift up is this idea that since this is God's plan, this is God's destiny, violence toward and political repression of anybody who's in the way of this plan is justifiable. So like as demographics of the country continue to undergo huge changes, with white Christians no longer being the majority, as the global economy keeps churning out crisis after crisis, driving mass migration, climate change, war, power brokers in the Christian nationalist network will do whatever they want, will do whatever they deem necessary to hold on to power. So that kind of violence, it can be very overt, but it can also be policy violence. It can be the violence of gerrymandering, vigilantism, lots of public gaslighting, storming the Capitol, all kinds of things. Did you notice there was nothing in there about Jesus? I think this is important. Nobody, first of all, is usually going to come up to you and say, I am a white Christian nationalist. That's bad PR. But they will preach about Jesus until they're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, like, this is an ideology that is about worshiping power and the right to rule. So if it were actually about worshiping Jesus and the good news that Jesus preached to the poor, the widow, the immigrant, there would not be this massive push toward policy violence against the poor in particular, against dispossessed people, and this really doubling down on cozying up to billionaires. It's a lot of hands.
So interesting stuff, Aaron.
Yeah.
As you were talking, I've never had these things come together in my mind, but I've been struggling with it. In the 1940s, I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt said there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And in the 1950s, we had McCarthyism versus some kind of proto-MAGA thing. Mm-hmm. In the 1980s, south of the border, we had liberation theology against what I consider escape theology. Mm-hmm. And of course, escape theology was funded by televangelists and George Bush and this kind of thing. And liberation theology was all about social and economic justice. And then in the 2020s, we have gay rights and democracy and economic justice and regressive versus progressive taxation against MAGA. So it's the same kind of dynamic, fundamentally based on economic justice, racism, and fear, that keeps trying to come back in, whether it's McCarthy or escape theology versus liberation theology, which I think liberation theology is much more in tune with honest Christian values. And then today, this fundamental attack on what is America. Am I reading too much into that, or does that kind of line up with what you're seeing?
Well, I think that lines up with a lot of things. I think a piece that I would add that for me is fundamental to how I understand the moment we're in now is that it has never been this continual, uninterrupted march toward progress, and we're always slowly pulling more and more people into the American dream or whatever, and then suddenly there's a backlash. I actually think a huge part of what's happening is that there has been abject failure by both parties to address fundamental, long-standing crises in this country, from the jump, right? That we have essentially two major parties who have completely abandoned the needs of everyday people. And that has been true across generations. And there's different forms of it. Certainly some people are prouder of that than others, acclaim that more stridently than others. Others are like, well, maybe we made some mistakes, but we would like to put a good face on it. But when you have so many people who do not have their basic survival needs met, right? So before COVID, we did an economic audit of the country, trying to see how conditions on the ground compared to the last campaign of Martin Luther King's life, the first Poor People's Campaign, right? It was in 1968. 50 years later, 2018, we did an economic audit checking for poverty, child nutrition, housing, all those things. And by every single measure, things were profoundly worse for more people across more lines of race, ethnicity, region, et cetera. And when the political direction, people with formal political power, elected office in the country, are willing to continue to sacrifice so many people, that is going to undermine democracy, right? They're not separate things. If people are struggling to find childcare, to have a job, to have housing, the way we need to be organizing, right, is to figure out how all those directly impacted folks can be part of coming up with solutions. But instead we have had a political system that's just phoning it in unless you can afford it. And really paying a lot of lip service in some ways to the struggles of various poor communities while abandoning people. And movements like White Christian Nationalism don't happen in places where equality is actually very strong, where most people are enjoying a high standard of living. It comes out of places where the inequality is already quite rampant. That's because it relies on voids of power, right? When I was organizing in Aberdeen and Grays Harbor County, there was a huge amount of folks who were not voting, right? Folks who were not registered. Let me say that. Registered voters were voting, but a huge number, particularly of younger people, who were checked out of the process. And it wasn't because they were lazy, right? It was because, one, they were surviving. There was nobody there connecting their immediate survival needs to like the political process. And two, there were not local officials who were actually like meeting people where they're at and saying, yes, the things that you are worried about are important and we're gonna fight for them. There was a lot of just a sense of abandonment and also material abandonment. And what that meant when a lot of people were checked out is that it was an opening for white Christian nationalists. When the timber economy pulled out, moved to the global south, it was really religious nationalists who stepped in and said, the reason that you're suffering in this hardworking community, it's not because of corporations, it's not because of there's an interest in exploiting forests and workers in the global south, it's because the gays and the welfare recipients and the immigrants and all the freeloaders are taking this country away from hardworking people like you, and if you want solutions, we're the people with solutions to that. And then there was just like a surge, I remember seeing it in real time, a surge in like the networks that were running white Christian nationalist adjacent candidates at very local levels, right? Like county commissioner, city council, school board, and building up from there. And again, that doesn't happen in places where things are actually going pretty good, right? That happens in places where, again, pretty demagogic forces like see a vacuum of power and are ready to take it.
How is your book available?
The book is available. You can go to bookshop.org, which is independent, and usually orders it from the nearest independent bookstore, which I like. You can also go to Broadleaf, which is the publisher. I think it's, broadleafbooks.com. You can order it there. It is available on Amazon. I prefer not to plug that. But yeah, you can order it online. And then I know in the Seattle area, Third Place Books has it. Probably a few others, but just call first and any bookstore can order it for you if you want to pick it up there.
Mary's given us little postcards that have
Yes, so if you grab one of those postcards.
well, and I'll have these available for anybody who wants to get these. So, yes.
Okay, I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but my question is for my own life. We are talking two different languages. You were just expressing exactly the language that I hear from my brother and my son, and I speak a different language. You know, but when I mention things like love and serving and things like that, that's almost like a foreign language to them, and theirs is a foreign language to me. How do we bridge that gap?
I think that's the question, and there's so much there, and I think a lot of it can be so specific to your relationships, right? Like, but I do know, like having worked with people who are not on the same page as me, I don't usually lead with talking at people or lead with talking. I usually like everything I can do to kind of like draw people out. So like let them do 70% of the talking. Honestly, increasingly, just so that people have the space maybe to like recognize their own cognitive dissonance with some of these things, but also just to like hear like what is actually happening here? Like how have folks who claim to follow Jesus in particular been sold this message? What are the scriptures that they're quoting? What are the media outlets that they're hearing? And not just pushing that away because it's gross, even though a lot of it is, or wrong, which a lot of it is, but being okay, there's this content that they're getting, and something about it has hooked them. Something in this story has hooked them. What is it? Is it that it's a message that they feel actually takes their anger seriously? And then, do they have some legitimate things to be angry about? Are there ways they are actually hurting? And what's a different story that could honor their anger, could honor maybe some of the real things they're struggling with, could honor their fear while not falling back on that scapegoating? For me, a lot of the time, I do go back to the Bible. Especially if I'm talking with Christian people, that is if this is authoritative for you and authoritative for me, there's going to be something here that we can study together, and it's a big ask because I think we have slept on how well white Christian nationalist networks have claimed the Bible as theirs and theirs alone, and claimed themselves to be the most legitimate authority. But if you look at the material that they're putting out, the stuff that's circulating, their little ministry pamphlets, devotionals, etc., it's not theologically deep. It's not very biblically grounded. It's a lot of proof texting. There's a lot of just ignoring huge swaths of scripture. And so I tend to start there. So on the one hand, lots of room for kind of listening, not passively listening and not necessarily believing what somebody's telling you, but all of it is information. It's sort of your research, right? It's okay, this person is coming in with all of this stuff, and can I be a little bit detached and analytical and collect the data and then see what's moving them, what's hooking them, whether it's some community they found because they're very isolated, or some interpretation of Christianity and the Bible that is important to them, somehow has tapped into some of their experience. And am I connected to something else that would offer them just as much community or just as much spiritual nourishment? I think that's part of it. I think it's also important for us to know that, again, none of these prominent architects of white Christian nationalism are gonna lead with I'm a white Christian nationalist and blah blah blah. That's bad PR. The churches that are very white Christian nationalist adjacent are not gonna put that on the reader board outside, right? They're leading with a lot of programs. They're leading with a lot of it's Vacation Bible School, it's affordable childcare, it's community meal programs, it's all things that you need to do, but then you get people in the door by being relevant to their daily lives and their need for community, and then the ideology and the theology is introduced after people's other core needs are here. So it's not just something that's happening in people's heads, right? This is a very isolating country. This is a very unequal country. People are looking to get their survival needs and community needs met. And if we haven't figured out how to be just as relevant and just as present on the ground in our communities as white Christian nationalist networks, we have to do better at that.
I don't like microphones. Can you hear me?
I can now, yeah.
I have kind of grown up basically believing that you know, that people are good, you know, the conscience of man, you know, good versus evil kind of thing. And, but I can't help but see a lot of envy, you know. Everybody wants to have more money so they can, you know, have more stability and stuff like that. And I can see where there's anger, you know, that anger at your circumstances, and then somebody comes in and says, hey, you know, that kind of thing. You know, everybody wants that kind of security. And do they know that they're actually preying on people that are underprivileged, so to speak? Do you think that they know? Because I think that's just mean.
I think there is
It's mean.
I think it sort of depends on like what level you're talking about, but I certainly think like at the highest levels of power, there's a very intentional strategy. There's a very intentional strategy about pitting struggling communities against each other. And that goes back to older than America. The whole Bible attests to like what it has taken, right? To knit folks who are struggling together in the face of very unequal, unjust, manipulative systems, whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it's the Egyptian Empire. Like we actually have a wealth of stories about how hard it was to counter those things and what it took. So I do think that there is a level of absolute political manipulation happening. And that's an old script. Like I think especially when I think about where I grew up in upstate New York, right? Has been like a very poor and working class community forever, since the American project unfolded. And I grew up in New York State, rural, but like definitely north. A number of my classmates like had Confederate flag bumper stickers, and my high school economics teacher had a full-size Confederate flag hanging in our public school classroom. And I was just always like, what is weird? This is New York? This is New York. I really don't, I know usually generically what that means, but like we are all New Yorkers, and this is not the state that was on the side of that line. What is that? And then I found out actually that there were parts of upstate New York that were, at the time of the Civil War, Confederate sympathizing counties because they were very working class, and somebody had sold them, politicians, business leaders, all kinds of forces that were opposed to the abolition of slavery, told white workers, you cannot compete with free black labor. It will be your demise. It will be the ruination of your family if these people get their freedom. And I just think about that a lot because I think that's a script that we have taken and updated to meet the various crises that we're facing in society, to pit poor communities against each other. So it's very parallel, I think, to what we're hearing said about immigrants, right? The way that you're, US born, maybe white, struggling family is gonna get their dignity back is to get rid of these immigrants who are taking your jobs and blah, 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 blah. So I think that manipulation is longstanding in this country. And I do think, though, that you're right, that there is a spiritual element. I think there's always a spiritual element to what's happening. I think that people see how close to the edge most of us are. How actually none of us are secure. This is not a secure society. We're all quite precarious for the most part, some more than others, but it's looking worse and worse for everybody. And how you face that choice is very spiritual, right? So are you going to face that choice and say, everything I can do to distance myself from other suffering people, to reject other suffering people, and cozy up to ingratiate myself to people with power, people who are responsible for the mass impoverishment of most of this country, like fall in line with that. I'm hanging my hat on that. Or do you say, actually, I have so much in common with other struggling people, and clearly the folks who are running this show do not have any of our best interests at heart. Like, I am gonna ride with other struggling people and build our unity, like build our care for each other, build our power together, which I think is very much aligned with the Jesus movement. So yeah, I think it is both an intentional strategy, but I think there's absolutely the spiritual dimension of it too. Yeah.
Maybe one or two more questions.
Okay.
I just listened to a podcast this week that was just so disturbing to me, that just hit at kind of the core of my own sense of spirituality and life. And there's a movement within kind of the white nationalist church that has come up with the label of toxic empathy. And it was just such a disturbing kind of shift on the Jesus Gospels, right? Yeah. And I was just beyond belief. I didn't even know what to make of it, other than I just feel so deeply disturbed by it. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know what my question is, but that's just a whole wicked turn that I had never even imagined, could happen within the Christian, our Christian family. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the phrase probably tells you everything you need to know. I mean, it just like when you hear things like that and you have that real visceral reaction, I think we can let ourselves be like, yes, that is the presence of spiritual evil, like that my body is reacting to, like, I actually know what that is. I know what that distortion means. It's blasphemy, like it's actual blasphemy. And, I don't like throw those words around at coffee hour a lot, but like there's a time and a place to say what it is to say that that is at all something you can reconcile with the gospel of Jesus Christ is blasphemy. Yeah.
So, it's getting to the end of the time here, but what are just a few suggestions that you have that we can do? Mm-hmm. I work in an industry that, health insurance. Mm-hmm. And it is hard for me to see what's happening there. So, and just, maybe a few things that people can do. The protests, the callings, all those things are good, but what do you suggest?
Yeah, I think everything matters. And so I think if you feel like what you're doing is like just so small and unimportant, just keep in mind how it's actually very important. Like every little vote does count. Every little letter you write does count. Every demonstration and protest you are able and willing to show up to does count. Bluey is great also. And I think also really taking seriously how important this place is, not just like as a church generically, but like as a church that is committed to the collective thriving and dignity of all God's children and the earth itself. That's actually probably the most important thing we have in this moment is Christian communities that are collectively continuing to live out the gospel's radical inclusion and nonviolence and welcome in a moment like this, to continue to do that. And it feels like, on the one hand, of course, not enough, because it's not a one church show, it's not a one person show, but like recognizing that everything that we do is more, the power of it is always more amplified when we do it together as a congregation, and then when we do it together as a network of congregations, when we do it together as a coalition, like all of that multiplication matters a lot. And then some like additional places that I really lean on for direction and for understanding. A place I used to work is called the Kairos Center. So kairoscenter.org is a network of a lot of folks that have been involved in the Poor People's Campaign, continuing to offer education, like understanding this moment in really grounded ways, putting forward the work of communities on the ground across the country, and also some internationally that are building a movement to contend white Christian nationalism. One of the ways that's maybe easiest and most fun to connect is Sunday afternoons. I think it's 3 o'clock Pacific time. The Kairos Center always puts on an online worship service called Freedom Church of the Poor, which I see very much as like a network that is counter to white Christian nationalism. So Freedom Church of the Poor is organized communities of poor folks, mostly in the States, coming together both to meet immediate needs, but also to study and organize together and to lift up a vision for this country where the last really are first, this country and the world. So kairoscenter.org is a place I really like. There's a few others. One of them is Surge. You might have heard of, Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ. A lot there about if you're in a predominantly white community or workplace or zip code or whatever, and like hearing people say very unhinged white Christian nationalist things like follow those candidates, etc. It's a network of folks who are committed to pulling poor and working class white people back into a multiracial movement for justice, dignity, economic thriving for all people. And I could think of a few more and I could email them and send them out. Cool.
I know you're too humble to say this, but buy the book. There's a lot of great information in that book. So I'm sorry, I know there's more questions out there. The thing that well, first I just want to thank you so much for being here today. I also really want to thank the diversity inclusion team for making sure this happened today. So thank you all. I know some of you are scattered around, so just thank you for doing that. My big thing is whenever we have things like this, it's a lot of overwhelming information, right? And you're probably sitting there going, oh my God, I don't even know where to start. Pick one thing that you can do today. Pick one thing that's going to take you a month. Take one thing and that's going to take you 6 months, and then that one thing that's going to take a year, and do one step in front of the other, right? Don't take it all in at once. Be like, I got to do all this stuff right now. One thing today, one thing in a month, one thing in 6 months, one thing in a year, and just keep going out from there. Again, just thank you so much. I figured I would, if it's okay, I'd just close us in prayer and
Please.
go about our Sunday. I invite you just to close your eyes and take a deep breath in and out, because that always feels so good. Let's do it again. And out. Gracious God, we give thanks for this time to gather and to be challenged, to be reminded of love and compassion in the ways that Jesus showed us how to walk one step in front of the other. We give thanks for all of my siblings today, especially Aaron for coming up and sharing his book and his wisdom. And I thank each one of my siblings here for having an open heart to be here, to show up and to just listen and to have the Holy Spirit move in and around them. Keep us safe and keep us healthy as we move through this week until we gather again. All this and more we say.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.